So some of you are out there probably questioning the existence of this bubble in the middle. You see what we call political gridlock. And you see this happening, and you're like, how is it possible that this bubble exists if political gridlock can be the norm that we experience on a day-to-day basis? So what is political gridlock? Political gridlock is when the parties are so rooted in their ideology, when the Republicans become so rooted to a conservative ideology and the Democrats become so rooted in a liberal ideology that they fail to compromise in the public interest. And you might see that as an example of right now when we're talking about pandemic relief and it's going nowhere. Like a bill to actually have some pandemic relief before the election pretty much stalled. Why? Political gridlock. So here's the deal. If you look at this, if this bubble actually exists, if everybody's trying to capture in the middle, that means all of our elected officials should be from here. And how hard is it to compromise if your Democrats are there and your Republicans are here? You got a very narrow gap to bridge. It shouldn't be that hard to compromise. However, if the reality is that your Republicans are over here and your Democrats are over here, then you're like, I can see why political gridlock might become the norm. There is a large chasm of space between the people. It'll be hard to bridge that and compromise. So how can we have a bubble in the middle and not have compromise? I will show you how that is. I've just redrawn our electorate line. Now the question isn't, what if the electorate line looks like this? The question is, where? Where does the electorate line look like this? Where in the country can I find an electorate that is predominantly conservative?
France.
That's right. I look at Alabama, I look at Texas, I look at Georgia, and maybe South Carolina, and I see an electorate that is predominantly conservative. So who gets elected from Texas, Alabama, South Carolina? Who gets elected? Conservatives get elected, right? Now they're still battling. They're battling with Democrats, right? But it's not likely that a Democrat's going to be elected. But if a Democrat is elected, they're going to be over here. But it's more likely than not that you're going to have conservatives that are fairly conservative elected from that part of the country. Okay? Again, the question is not what if this is the electorate line? The question is, where is this the electorate line? Where in the United States can I find an electorate that is predominantly liberal?
France.
And not just liberal. They're not moderately liberal. They are liberal. Where in the country can I find that? Well, you don't have to go too far from here. You just look over in Minneapolis and you can see an electorate that is predominantly liberal. And they've elected Ilhan Omar, the representative from the 5th Congressional District. So the House of Representatives is elected by congressional districts representing roughly 720,000 people. And a lot of our congressional districts look like this. Now, they might not be all liberal. They might be on the opposite end. They might all be conservative. But you look at Ilhan Omar. She represents that district. She's here. Okay? Is she anywhere near moderate? No, she's not. Is she in a position to compromise with people that are over here? Not really. If she were to do so, would she stay the elected representative of Congressional District 5? Probably not. She would lose that job. They would elect someone else that is going to maintain these beliefs. Okay? All right. So why do we have political gridlock? It might be that, yeah, when we average out all the ideologies in the country, we got a nice little bubble in the middle, but our elected representatives aren't elected by a national electorate. They're elected by a state electorate. They're elected by a congressional district electorate. And they represent the views of those places, states and congressional districts. Not even the president is elected by a national electorate. At least we could say there's an average, because there's 50 separate state elections that elect the president, right? So should he be representing the bubble in the middle? Sure. So it might exist, but our elected officials might not be in a position to actually represent the bubble in the middle. One way that we can explain the existence of political gridlock as a norm of our political institutions is by looking at the electorate itself and just the geographic locations by which our representatives, our senators, are being elected. They're coming from more conservative, more liberal places in the country. They're not being elected by the country as a whole. Okay, here's another way that we can explain the existence of political gridlock. It's called partisan sorting. And it starts with this. Now, this should be kind of the normal curve that we've been talking about and looking at, right? With the majority of the country in the moderate. But when partisan sorting happens, what we're talking about is people in the middle here moving and identifying with one of the political parties. They're sorting themselves ideologically and sorting themselves into political parties. Now, that's going to have an impact on our curve, and I hope to show you that so you can kind of see partisan sorting. All right, partisan sorting is the process of citizens in the middle, aligning themselves ideologically with the party on the left or the party on the right. And here's the impact. You can see that there's actually less people that have a moderate disposition, a moderate ideology. The other thing is I left up this original marker. This is where the base began for the Democratic Party. This is where the base began for the Republican Party. So what happens when partisan sorting occurs is you see a narrowing of the base. And remember, that's where we get our candidates from. We're getting our candidates and our ideas from this part of the political spectrum and this part of the political spectrum. Well, if this is where the candidates come from, is there going to be a greater or lesser chance of compromise? Obviously, there's going to be a lesser chance of compromise. Let's take it one step further. Here is the result of unfettered partisan sorting. You might have actually seen this type of electorate line before when we talked about what if we fail to actually maintain political culture? What if we let those values and beliefs that help construct the bubble in the middle and that unite us, what if those fall apart? This could be the result. So this is what would happen here, is you would note that the base itself now has gotten completely narrow on both ends. So you have a narrower base. There's more ideological consensus within the liberal base and within the conservative base. And is there even a need to appeal to the moderates to win the election? All of the votes are out at this end of the spectrum, and all of the votes are out at this end of the spectrum. So we call this party polarization. Okay, so party polarization is when the political parties themselves, the ideological distance between the Democratic and Republican Party has increased and the base itself has narrowed. So you have more of an ideological consensus, a narrow base, and a greater distance from the other party. Now, if that actually happens, if these two things are occurring, what's the possibility of compromise between the two parties? And governance, at the heart of good governance is compromise. The only way to govern, if this is what our system looks like, is for your party to actually control all of government. You got to win the presidency, you got to win all of Congress. Then you can govern. Because if you have a House that is made up of Democrats and a Senate that is made up of Republicans, and this is what it looks like, there's not going to be any compromise. Unless you don't mind not getting reelected. Because if you do end up compromising, your base is not going to reelect you on both ends of the spectrum.